1910, that's when we had like the end of the monarchy, and he had three pillars: God, nation, and family. Portugal had these ex-colonies in Africa, a huge moment of history, the first free elections with above 90% of participation.
Know Your Neighbors, a podcast by Maldo and Giulio.
Hello! Welcome to Know Your Neighbors, episode 12.
Yes, this time we're sure we checked before, so
This time it is 12.
Number 12.
approaching the halfway, by the way. So we are keeping the pace.
Cheers for that.
Yes.
Cheers, guys.
And how do we say
Cheers.
review the language?
Salud.
Salud.
Salud. Very similar because they're the actual neighbors,
Yes, with our nice super bulk.
which
So
actually is one of my favorite.
Because we have
beers.
standards here. We go for super bulk, we don't go for sagres.
for the Savage lovers, there's going to be a dispute.
Sorry, not
But
sorry.
that leads us to unveil the country we're going to talk about tonight with Bia. Welcome.
Thank you.
And which country you're going to tell us about?
So, Portugal. I'm gonna
Beautiful
talk about
country.
Yes.
Lovely country.
Yes, neighbor of Spain. And yeah, we have a very big, huge history, which would take us like, I don't know, another 12 to cover everything. But I think there are a few episodes of history that shaped us as we are today a lot, and I think it's nice to talk about it.
Yeah, because
That's
yeah,
what we want to hear.
exactly. Now, we know, of course, rich history of explorations and everything,
Yeah.
but as we know, we focus more on the more recent part. So where do we start? Where do you want to tell us?
So I think it's the best way to give it also a bit of context and not coming out of nowhere, to start from the end of the monarchy.
Mhm.
So I won't say a lot of dates, but I will just say this one to
No
situate us. But the 1910, that's when we had like the end of the monarchy.
How many years of monarchy you had
We
before?
had over 700 years, so a lot of time. And by the end of it, the scenario that we have is a scenario of a lot of poverty,
Mhm.
unhappiness within the people.
Yeah.
Economy was really weak, and so people start to dream of this concept of the republic, because it was like a promise of a better life, a better economy, more freedom, and so that's why we had the coup, and there was the overthrow of the monarchy and the implementation of the first republic. However, even though it was a big dream, it did not work very well, in the sense that there was a lot of surprise.
Dreams are not always as you think they are.
There was like a huge amount of instability. The governments would not be stable enough to stay for long, so very short duration governments. And these lasted, I think, more or less 14, 15 years.
Okay.
And yeah, the poverty still was
Still there, yeah.
Nothing really changed in that sense. So that's a bit the scenario that we have when this figure, that it's one of the most famous figures of our history, his name is António de Oliveira Salazar, but we call him, and I think everybody knows him as Salazar.
Yeah.
He appears in this scenario, and he was just, I think, an academic. He was people say a simple man, very smart.
Sorry. When it comes to the coup d'etat for the First Republic,
Yeah.
was it like military coup d'etat, or who was?
It was relatively. It was coming from this idea of the republic. It came from people like academics, so
Okay.
people that had access to
More like intellectual.
Yes,
Yeah.
intellectual.
Yeah.
So of course, people that maybe had access to what was happening in other countries in Europe.
Yeah.
So they were a bit responsible for designing this coup. So yes, we have this man, this person, Salazar, that appears, and he presents himself as the person that will bring order to the system, to the country, to the economy. And first, initially, he comes as the Minister of Finance.
Okay.
So, and he demands to have a lot of power and a lot of control over the finances. So he actually manages to bring it to a better state which made him gain a lot of trust, a lot of prestige, and from here he's selected to become like this mega, almost I think the concept would be like a super prime minister, but
Okay.
the name of it, and I'm doing a direct translation, it was the president of the council of ministers.
Which is
Okay.
actually the same way we call the prime minister in Italy. So
Yeah,
it's,
okay.
I see the.
The concept.
So let's say he kept the title, but in reality was
Yeah.
Like overseeing everything. So we can call
Everything.
him a dictator. Like.
Yeah, in a nutshell, yes, we
In
can.
a nutshell, we can summarize it.
So yeah, and actually that was the
Dictators never want to be called dictators. So
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, but we can say that. So yeah, that actually marked the beginning of our dictatorship.
Mhm.
Which year more or less?
So this was 1926 that he
Okay.
came.
Okay.
So almost 15 years after the First Republic. And from here he creates this regime, this authoritarian regime, which like it's like checking boxes of a typical authoritarian regime. First of all, elections were a complete sham. It was filled with fraud, a lot of manipulation of results. You had the police that was in charge of controlling anything that was said against the regime should be punished, and it could be maybe an organized movement or like a person like me or you.
Yeah.
This you could not. So there was a lot of control over people, and of course Salazar, he was a nationalist man. He was against parliament. He was against the very existence of political parties. So
Yeah.
those didn't exist, or were not supposed to exist. There was a lot of censorship as well. There's this concept that people today still talk about, which was the blue pencil, which is the
Okay.
figure of the blue pencil that was crossing all the newspapers and the books, anything, because they were just censoring
Makes
everything.
sense. Yeah. So they were like deciding what
Exactly.
could be published and
Yeah.
or not. Yeah.
So they called it, like people called it that, the blue pencil. He of course, with this, it's no surprise, it's a typical characteristic. He was just trying to control people's he didn't want anyone to have a critical mind, basically.
Yeah.
And also he had this concept of what society should be, a society with virtue should be, and he had 3 pillars, which were God, family, and nation. Actually, in the other one, God, nation, and family. That was the order. It became like a bit of a slogan. And family,
and nation.
yeah,
God, nation and family.
yes,
Okay.
and family also was supposed to follow this very specific type of model.
Traditional models.
Exactly. Gender roles were super well defined. There was even a guide to the good wife.
Yeah.
So it was really, he was really, and he
I'm
was also.
sure I would follow that guy.
It would be great nowadays, no? Yeah, it's a bit of it's all the signs of an authoritarian regime, and he was also a man, a person that came from the countryside. So he also believed that the countryside was the place where the virtue was, like the cities corrupted people. So he had this very like old school like type of mentality, and he wanted to implement that into society.
It's crazy. This is a side comment, but it's crazy how much we are shaped by our own experiences.
Definitely.
And we kind of define whether it's good or bad based on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of studies about him, obviously, and a lot of people say that his childhood, his upbringing really shaped everything about him that actually created a dictatorship, which is huge.
If you think about it, yeah, like the experiences of one person
Yeah.
end up influencing the ones of millions.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, he created this regime, and in fact, he did invest a lot of money in schools, for instance, in infrastructure. But the people, so not speaking of elite, but the majority of people were living off agriculture. So that was the reality. Then in parallel of all this, we have World War II happening. With World War II, Salazar, he keeps this very neutrality type of mentality, and he actually does a bit of this juggling act, because he kind of manages both sides of the war that had interest in taking Portugal as an ally, and he's able to keep the dialogue and maintain this kind of neutrality for the country, which created a lot of isolation for the country, and in fact there's a lot of analysis being done today that say that it was because one of the factors that conditioned Portugal's development or lack of development was actually not joining the war, which is an interesting take. And after
I mean, you spared a lot of loss of human life, but at the same time,
from the human point of view, great, but then you don't really get the influence of these other countries that are probably already more advanced than we were. You don't. There's a war kind of implies some technological advancement, so you kind of miss the train.
I had never really seen a war like this. Like as having.
No, she's right. You
Also
think
creating
about
opportunities in a way. It somehow creates
a lot
opportunities.
of technological development actually comes from military stuff first.
And from a strategic point of view for a country, I guess that's where the analysis is done. Of course, from the human point of view, human lives, it's obviously positive. But then with the end of the war, we have, of course, the creation of the United Nations. All these movements of independence of all territories start to emerge, and with it, like a lot of pressure for Portugal to also let go of the ex-colonies, which is this huge topic for the Portuguese history. So Portugal had these ex-colonies in Africa, and Salazar was really very not flexible at all in terms of how he looked at these movements that were emerging, because obviously the independent movements in the ex-colonies were starting to gain a lot of strength. Salazar said, no, Portugal is this big land that is spread across colonies. No, we are one. So no, he did not want to let them go, and of course this created even more isolation within the international community, because they didn't support and they were trying to influence Portugal to give into the independent movements in a way that was maybe smooth and maybe smarter, that could keep like some of the interests.
Just some relationship at least with the
exactly. So, but he didn't. He never wanted that, and basically, so like to put it a bit in a conclusion, in terms of what Salazar brought us. Okay, we know it's a dictatorship, but some people argue, because he invested in schools and he invested in all this infrastructure, but he was also surrounded by this elite that was gaining a lot of power and taking advantage of that power. They were very wealthy, and in contrast, we had the majority of population super poor that was living off of agriculture.
Just surviving,
Plus, the money was being spent on maintaining this war in the ex-colonies.
Against independence.
Exactly.
Maybe just for context, if you can recap at least the main colonies that were, so that we can locate them, or at least know the names.
So the main ones were Angola, Mozambique, Cabo Verde. Sorry, I'm saying them in Portuguese.
Go for it.
And Guinea. I think maybe I'm forgetting, but those were a bit the big names.
The big ones,
So with all this happening, what we saw was a huge movement of people actually wanting to escape the country, looking for better conditions of life, and our neighbors, Spain, they were also under a dictatorship, so they couldn't
So
really.
the best choice.
No.
If you don't remember or don't know about it, check the Spain episode because we talked about it extensively. So
Indeed. Good episode.
Quiz time.
Zero bias.
hey Carlos, thank you.
So yeah, instead of going to Spain, they actually went to France, to Germany, and to Luxembourg. So that's actually why we have this huge amount of Portuguese people here in Luxembourg. They came back then, so in the 60s, throughout the whole dictatorship, and then these people started to create their families. So now there's already the second generation, the third generation. So
in case somebody doesn't know, we are based in Luxembourg.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's crazy.
There's a very, very big Portuguese community here.
And a lot of
the
people
fact that they
ask me,
sell Superbog everywhere is a sign. Not for real. Like in every supermarket they have Superbog or Sagres, and like in general.
Yeah.
If you ask me, better than Bofferding or this kind of thing, which are the Luxembourgish beers, but
it's like Superbook.
Yes.
go for Superbog.
Yeah. Basically, a lot of people ask me why we have the connection here in Luxembourg, why there are so many, and it actually comes from that time that we were really in a position that people needed to live in.
So it was in the 40s, more or less.
60s. Around the 60s it started, and I think it continued throughout the whole period of dictatorship.
But as we were mentioning before when we were talking, the choice of Luxembourg was actually a bit random, right?
Yeah.
It was not for a specific reason.
No, I think it was like Central European countries, because there's Switzerland as well. France, there's a huge community as well. Germany, I'm not sure if as big, but also.
Yeah.
So I think Central Europe was a big destiny for people to go. So yeah, that's a bit the scenario that we have around this time. And in fact, Salazar, he kept being in power until the end of his life. So he never, people say that by the end of it was not really him taking charge anymore. It was like the elite around him, but he was there. So then we had this next person that came after him. His name was Marcel Caetano, and he was this, he brought some hope to the people. So people thought, okay, maybe he will bring the country to a transition. He will lead us towards a more democratic type of system. And in fact, people say that he created the initial characteristics of what today is the social security system.
Okay.
But on the other hand, he kept following Salazar's footsteps on many other stuff. For instance, the police. Okay. He changed the name to make it look a little lighter, but it was still the same concept.
Just a rebranding.
Yeah, just a rebranding, but same thing. And
as strict and
still with the same goal as before.
Yeah.
And most importantly, he kept the same position regarding the ex-colonies. So still here, even after the death of Salazar, we still don't give in to the independent movements in Africa.
So let's say this continuous war
continues, keeps going. And this moment is when these movements, the resistance movements, start to kind of appear and organize. Of course, in secret, everything was illegal. One of them is, for instance, very, very known even today, the Socialist Party. They started to organize, and in parallel, the military, they started to understand, okay, doesn't really matter how many generations come after Salazar, nothing will actually change. They saw it with this Marcel Caetano, the one that came after. Okay, small changes, but it's the same. So, and also the military, especially the young military, they were the ones that were being sent to the ex-colonies to fight. So they were being the ones that were being sacrificed. So they started to organize themselves to create a revolution to overthrow the regime. Yeah. And that's how we had our revolution on the night of 24 to 25 of April 1974. This date is important.
1974.
Yeah.
So it was basically almost 50 years of dictatorship from 1926 to 1974.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. It was very long. This revolution is iconic for our history. It's called the Carnation Revolution because the flowers, the carnations, became huge symbols of the revolution. It kind of happened a little bit as a coincidence. This lady apparently was around there and she had the flowers. Yeah, it's really funny because it was not on purpose. She had the flowers for work, and there was a revolution, so they were not really needed for work anymore. And a soldier, I think, he asked her for a lighter, and she said, "No, I don't have, but I have this flower." She put it on the top of the gun and then started to distribute, and that's how it became a symbol. And in fact, it was a very peaceful revolution, and it was, people tell, when they are telling the story, that it was a moment of happiness, a moment of euphoria for the people. So yeah, that's when we had the end of the dictatorship finally, and after that we had to have some type of order, let's say, otherwise the country would fall into an anarchy. And so the military created this movement to take charge a bit of the country while we didn't have the first elections, which, by the way, were also a huge moment of history. The first free elections with above 90% of participation. People were extremely enthusiastic about it. And that's when we had our first government, our first constitution. The Socialist Party won, and the government was created as we know it in the models that we know it today.
And the elections were like a bit after the Carnation Revolution.
It was in 76, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So a bit after. So yeah, that's also the moment where we finally give into the independent movements in the ex-colonies. This topic is huge in terms of the conversation that happens between people in society. There's a huge debate. It's very divisive. The people who orchestrated the revolution, of course, they say there was no other way but to give into the movements without really negotiating. There was no room for negotiation because the history before didn't really build up for that. It was that or nothing.
So the only way was to like let go the colonies without
completely.
any,
Because which type of negotiation would they?
They could maybe keep some business interests, something like that, or something that wouldn't create that hostile environment against the people maybe living there, that wouldn't force people to leave the way that they left.
Rich.
Great rich. People had to leave. So the Portuguese from the mainland that were living there and were completely settled, they were forced to come back, and we are talking about millions of people. My grandparents were living in Guinea, and it was exactly that situation. They were forced to come back, and that's a bit the shock that existed for the people, for society, because people who came back, and I do have the example of my family that my granddad used to tell me his opinion that this letting go of the ex-colonies was done in such a drastic way that they were forced to come back and start over, knowing that before they were used to a certain
standard of life or a certain way of life at least.
Exactly, they had to restart from zero, and it was a bit of a shock in terms of society, but also in terms of economy, because the money that you need to spend to reintegrate these people into society, it's huge. So
1 million of people,
more even. I don't know. I think it's 2 or 3 million, something like that.
Which for Portugal as well, because you guys are
not that many exactly. So yes, that was a bit of an issue in terms of economy. Because I think we even used a lot of the money that we had from the Estado Novo, so from the time of Salazar. We used to reintegrate these people. But thank God at that time there was later on the integration of the European Economic Community. That kind of came a bit, I'm not going to say to the rescue, but kind of in the sense that they gave us a lot of resources.
Yeah.
And that was a bit of a honeymoon period. And in fact, the decision to join this community was really done as a political, people say nowadays it was really a political vision, because the person who did it, or who was, leading it, was the leader of the Socialist Party. He had the vision that if Portugal joined this European community, it would have a different capacity to influence decision making at a more global level. So there was this hope to really integrate something bigger and to develop.
Because actually, certain trials, something that we didn't say, but I think it emerges from the thing we said, that Portugal was very isolated until now, and actually on purpose, right?
Exactly.
They wanted to be on their own, so it was very
proudly
not
alone,
connected.
as Salazar used to say.
Exactly.
Proudly,
so not connected
proudly
to
alone,
the rest of the
exactly.
world.
So yeah, there was this willingness to kind of gain that visibility as well. And these resources were useful. I think they built a lot of infrastructure. However, they did not manage to invest this money into sectors like agriculture, industry, to modernize them to the point that they would become, they would have export potential. So at some point we were spending more than we were able to produce, and this became an issue, and we actually had to ask for financial aid already back then. Which
around the...
So we joined the EEC, I think, in '86. So
yeah,
exactly. We had to ask for help, and it's a bit of it kind of goes to show exactly how the economy was doing, kind of preparing for us to understand what happens later on when the economic crisis hits.
Yeah.
We are too vulnerable, we are too exposed, and of course it happens that we crashed. And
so basically you already had help from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, already back then in the 90s. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if it's exactly the 90s, because I remember, but this is my memory, that the 90s were this moment of a lot of prosperity. So maybe it's in perception, but yes, it was actually new information for me that we actually needed to get financial aid back then, but we did, and it makes sense because when we had the financial crisis later on, we were really, really vulnerable. So it makes sense.
You paved the ground in a way
to explain how bad we did. And again, when that happened, we had to ask for financial aid again. We had the period of Troika, which is a commonly used name that we heard. I remember, I was a child, but I remember it constantly on the news. Troika,
which was IMF, the ECB, European Commission.
Exactly, the entity that was the agreement that we had, that they would provide us the resources, and in exchange they would supervise our policies to
spending cuts.
Exactly. And it was a time of a lot of austerity. And
just for context, I mean, I think it's clear, but just we're talking about the post 2008 financial crisis.
Exactly.
For
me, it's like our generation.
I think
but
coming from Spain and Italy, I think for us,
we know what
it's
it
a pretty
is.
clear cut-off point. But yes,
we know. But yes, it was a very difficult moment. For I guess we all know that reality. We had the people working for the public sector that really had suffered a lot of cuts in their salaries, freezing of the careers, a lot of spending cuts. So the population, so we can argue the measures were necessary, but the feeling within the population was really extreme discontent, a lot of unemployment, specifically within young people. And this is actually a time that we see a huge amount of people, young people, hyper qualified people, immigrating and going
yourself.
Yeah.
And all our wonderful Portuguese friends here.
Yeah,
So
a lot of Portuguese.
there is an upside now.
So we're happy you're here.
But
Yeah.
at the same time, we are here as well.
Exactly,
Yes.
we're all here.
There's a reason.
Southern Europe is
But,
very
yeah.
strong.
Personally, not same reasons completely.
Oh yeah, well.
Completely.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, for me as well, like it's not exactly that, my generation is not exactly that direct effect, but it's definitely connected.
Yeah. 100%.
So yeah, we had this very critical moment that I think me and my generation, we all remember it quite well. But the measures did work, so we came to a balanced economy. And then we had these years of we had in power the government, the main parties basically, they were alternating.
Yeah.
But lately we saw, like in many other European countries, the immersion of the far right party, that of course takes advantage of a lot of points that the population is unhappy about. They take advantage of those points, and they kind of make their
they exploit
argument
the fear,
and-
they exploit
exactly.
the
They don't really
unhappiness.
give you any proper. They don't tell you how they're going to change things. They just tell you they're going to change things. So classic. So that's a bit where we are today. So we are living a moment of some political uncertainty as well. We saw in the few years lately, we saw some cases of corruption, political instability. So we don't really know what's going to happen next. We also don't really know how the economy will do. Also, knowing what's happening around the world, Ukraine, Middle East, US, so a lot of things.
Crops for the future.
Yeah. So it's a bit of an uncertain moment. We really cannot guess. So that's a bit. But in my opinion, where we are today has been very influenced by all this history that we have in the past.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And you had elections recently, right?
In May.
It was in May. Okay.
And right now you don't have yet a coalition that is gonna
Exactly.
back in the government, so you don't know yet how
We
it's
don't
gonna. Well, then stay
Fingers
tuned.
crossed.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned for Portugal. Doo-doo.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a bit in a nutshell why we are here today, basically.
Why and how, in which shape. Okay, super nice, super interesting. I think
Yes.
it's an amazing, being such a close neighbor,
I know.
it's crazy. I had no idea,
You're really meeting your neighbor.
yeah, literally.
Finally, the Spanish know our history.
Okay, and as a closure, super quick
Yeah.
about Brazil.
Yeah.
Brazil,
Let's bring the
Portugal.
Brazilians to bring it to a more
Yes.
fun note.
Woo!
Fair enough. 'Cause
You're
they're
like you're supposed to be like child, but actually
Yeah.
big brother. I
Yeah.
don't know how to even say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. So the relationship with Brazil dates back to many years ago. Brazil is an ex-colony.
Yeah.
It was a colony for over 300 years.
Because
if I'm
here,
not
I
mistaken.
think maybe disclaimer, you had more colonies than
Yes.
those four
Over
where
over
all
time.
this conflict
Yeah, yes.
happened, but they
were
were
lost
given or
before, yeah.
lost before, exactly.
Mhm. In Brazil, it
Including
started in
Brazil.
the 16th century, so
Yeah.
really back then. Of course, I don't need to say it was not a sea of roses. We don't need to go into
over there, yeah.
the topic, but we know it's today a huge debate, and I'm glad it is that people are talking about it. But nowadays, the relationship that we have with Brazil, it was a long period of history together. So they do have a lot of cultural influence from
Yeah.
Portugal. Okay, the language, starting from the language.
Yeah.
But of course, then they have their own culture, which is
Of course, yeah.
so rich and so good. But there is a huge connection. And specifically, there's this thing that is the community of Portuguese-speaking nations, something like this. It's the CPLP in Portuguese. That it's not just Brazil and Portugal; it's also Angola, Mozambique, Guinea. So the ones that we mentioned before. And in this community, the goal is to really create a climate of cooperation between all of them. There's a lot of agreements, specifically, mainly around education, a lot of mobility between all of them. So really the goal of it is to create, I would say the pillars of it is to create peace, cooperation, sustainable development.
Interesting.
Because there are not so many countries that are speaking Portuguese. In Brazil, you know, in Latin America, it's the only one. So,
so it's kind of united forces.
Yes,
between...
actually, the language does have a very big impact here. So we do have that community that tries to connect all of them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Arguably, I've heard, although as a non-speaker, I don't know that Brazilian Portuguese sounds better than Portugal Portuguese, but I'll leave that to.
No, I'm gonna be honest, because me, I'm also a bit biased. I have a bunch of family in Brazil, and I think they do have a very fun accent. They have a very good sense of humor. I feel like as Portuguese, when we speak, we have this very serious kind of heavy kind of tone, and no, they seem like they're singing. I gotta say that, but I mean, that's an opinion.
Debatable,
That's debatable.
We leave it to the listeners to decide.
Exactly. Maybe later on you can expand your podcast and invite Brazil as well.
Oh, we will for sure.
Yes,
100%.
It's something in the pipeline. First 27 member states, then we'll
but stay tuned.
Continue.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so thanks a lot.
Thank you.
It was
Thank you,
super amazing. And see you everybody in the next episode 13. Bye.
Ciao.